welcome and welcome Shannon to open sourcing as an ethos.
Great, thanks. And I really appreciate the three people, I think Sarah, Norin, and Jane, who were able to just give a word about what they're potentially interested in related to open source, because I think it's a nice span of the different types of activities that can happen in open source. So open sourcing websites, thinking about how a model can spread because of the open source nature of it. And Jane, talking about the work that you're doing in Argentina, this actually potentially gets into some of my interest on a newer kind of strain around open sourcing hardware. So the tangible and the physical objects that we come into interaction with every day. So I run an organization called Public Lab. The very long name of it is Public Laboratory for Open Technology and Science. And we started way back in 2010 during the BP oil disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. I have for a long time, pretty much my entire adult life and even as a child, have been a community organizer. So I'm really interested in creating spaces where people can come to collaborate and interact and share and learn in a way that is not putting one person with a different expertise higher than the others. So we started Public Lab with the recognition that there was not good information or data that was coming out of the BP spill. At that immediate moment, I was working on oil refining issues across Louisiana and Mississippi, supporting communities to do community monitoring programs specifically around air and water quality. What we pretty immediately noticed with the BP spill was that there was not a good way for the media to begin telling the story of how this was really unfurling for people who are locally living in the Gulf Coast area. And very pragmatically, there was also a flight cap that was put over the Gulf where the spill was happening within a couple days. So it meant that planes could not fly to be able to capture good enough imagery to be able to actually show the extent of the BP spill. So what we started doing, and at the time we were a very nascent group that was kind of self-organizing in person for the most part in Louisiana, but then also just through a very basic WordPress blog called Grassroots Mapping, we started to launch tethered balloons that were filled with helium and kites that had very simple point and shoot cameras. And this was kind of our first time really playing around with open sourcing a hardware device. So we would take the cameras and we would hack the cameras so that they were able to go up and take multiple images. So we would take the balloons up to 3,000 feet. We would bring them back down after about 30 minutes to an hour, and we would have thousands and thousands of pictures that showed the extent of the BP spill from an aerial perspective. So this was really the immediate moment of Public Lab. At the time, we were using all open source modeling. So everything from the work that we were doing, putting images out into the public domain, which is a more specific kind of open model for data, to the actual cameras and kits that we were using that were based on principles of open hardware. What doing these kind of open modelings allowed us to do was to then share back and forth. So for instance, I would send a kit to a community maybe 7 hours away in the panhandle of Florida. And they would say, well, our wind conditions are such that we can't use this specific kite, but we're going to make a modification to it that best serves the local weather conditions that we have. So the open source piece of this allowed for rapid local modification. It also allowed for sharing. It allowed for us to scale in a way that didn't take intense amounts of financial resources or person time, because we were very focused on posting all of the how-tos and the kind of lessons that we had learned, both the things that really worked and the things that really failed, openly and transparently on the blog site that we had at the time. It also, in this model, allowed us to better communicate across geographic locations. So we had people in New York City running what they called a situation room. So we were sending data sets to New York to help process the maps that were coming out of the spill. So basically during this time, it was really an initial moment of a very, very local event happening in which we were applying open source methodology, but then also engaging the global, so engaging people from far away that wanted to interact. And I think that was really crucial at that time to guide the project to where it went. So by the end of the BP spill period, when the well had been capped, we had worked with about 350 people, both locally and basically across the world, who were interested in supporting on the data side. But locally, it included high school students, people who were concerned about their fishing grounds, Tulane University students, different environmental and public health NGOs from across the Gulf South. So we had a mass ability to bring people in because we were putting our material out openly and transparently. And it also allowed us to collect major amounts of data. So within several months, we had hundreds of thousands of images and been able to, on our feet or on small boats, map about 100 miles of coastline during the BP spill. So this was really the kind of coming together moment of where we started working with one another. And from there, we kind of took a step back and looked at what had worked and what hadn't worked during the spill. And we started to think about what we were going to do next. At the time, and again, this was back in 2010, there were few people across the board that were focused on creating low cost and highly accessible, both because of documentation and because of the contextualizing of tools specifically for environmental monitoring. At that point, hardware devices and monitoring tools were primarily being created at a price point and accessibility level for industry to do their own self-monitoring, which is problematic. For government agencies who were doing monitoring, but also recognizing limited capacity many times, and for research institutions. So we came at this and said, we want to change the paradigm of how people have access to tools. And open sourcing was a very important piece of that. I would say from the BP spill, the ability to spread our work rapidly was due in very large part to open sourcing. It was almost infectious, I think. I've used that word several times to describe how open source can transfer things and knowledge. But for instance, within about a year, people had taken on the entire model of aerial mapping using balloons and kites and cameras and moved it to the Gowanus Canal, where there's an EPA Superfund site, to do a very different type of monitoring, but using similar methods as we had developed in the Gulf Coast. They were going out in the middle of wintertime, so they were also faced with very different weather conditions. And because of the open source nature of the tools, they were able to modify them to their needs and be able to proceed with their project. So that's just a bit about my background and how I've come to this. I think a couple other points that are important is that as we have created Public Lab, so we now have a very robust, and Sarah, you may want to take a look at our website, a very robust web portal that's called publiclab.org. It's based on a Drupal and wiki system so that people can collaboratively write documentation on the wiki. And then also post individual research notes, narratives, blogs that are all highly editable, that can be tagged back and forth. We've created question and answer systems that go more hand in hand with the environmental nature of our work and being able to connect communities across mass geographies. So for instance, a group who is worried about methane in New Zealand can connect with a group in Louisiana who is also concerned about methane. And they can learn from one another, they can learn from successes, they can learn from failures, and they can transfer knowledge in a way that doesn't mean each of these groups is having to figure out how to deal with methane and their own physical geographies. In terms of how our organization has developed, I think that the ethos of open source has also been really important to us in terms of the culture that has become inherent in Public Lab. So we have tended to side on a flat structure over the years. And I think that's, hopefully in many open source cases, quite inherent in the structure, so that there is not a mass kind of authoritarian rule. But it's also, I think, for me as somebody who has to manage an organization and, be the one that is making sure we're abiding by laws, there've really been some like bump up points where potentially the philosophy of open source and open communities doesn't quite match with the realities of laws and legal structures that currently exist. So in kind of my side brain and head, this is one of the things that I'm really interested in is how can we create healthy open ecosystems and open cultures within organizations that allow us to grow in the ways that we want to, but don't necessarily vibe with the legal requirements in some of the places that we're working. So this is a kind of project that I've been working on the side, writing about, and has not come to completion because it's really complicated. I think the other thing is really kind of embedding what open means as a culture within communities and organizations, and thinking about the importance of setting values, setting norms, setting kind of the expectations of what it means when you enter into an open space. So for us in Public Lab, that means things like maintaining a code of conduct, because we're asking people as a community to rapidly communicate with one another, and we're all coming from many different cultures and many different places, and sometimes the way that someone might say one thing may not, oh, hi cat, cat break. And nice to see you too, but it was just the cat. So sometimes the way that we're communicating across different cultures may not potentially vibe with a conversation. And so having really good guidelines in place that can provide the constraints, boundaries, and kind of growth places in a community has been really important. Also having principles that say, when Public Lab partners with a group, when we talk about community, these are the things that we inherently hold as the values which guide what we're doing. We expect this of our community, and you should expect this of Public Lab, and really hold us to doing that. And I think having those kind of structural things around values and principles and codes of conduct has been incredibly important for the mass growth that we have had. And at this point, we're probably about, I would say, 12,000 people that are doing various things around the world. And that ranges from our open source hardware developer community to our software developer community, to all of the various people that are contributing information and talking about environmental questions that they have. I also, in the last several years, since about 2015, have started and been working with another community that is called the Global Open Hardware Movement. So it's people that since, over the last decade have gotten more and more interested in applying open source modeling to the scientific world and to the equipment that is inherent in our work. So this is something that I think Public Lab is really an early kind of innovator on. And I've been really happy to see this space boom in a way that was really unanticipated. Public Lab was the first community to do a large-scale adoption of open source licensing onto our hardware products. And we've seen a lot of movement in that space as well. We have a really long way to go before there is complete ubiquity around using open source licensing in the physical world. A lot of challenges around policy, a lot of challenges around funding. We're still in funding models where the status quo is to ask why you would open source rather than to ask why you have something with a proprietary license. And that's a paradigm that we really need to work on flipping. So there's challenges like that that I see as kind of the next phase of where open sourcing is going. Other challenges that I think are important to note, and I'm kind of framing this more around the product world that we live in, so the more physical elements, but definitely also applicable to the software piece and to the online world as well. So I think the data literacy and variability aspect of it, and I'm not going to get too in depth into data and scientific terms, but just when we have so many, for instance, air quality monitors that are popping up, how do we make sure that we're maintaining a standards where data is good across all of those monitors, and not just creating kind of a messy technology ecosystem where people can't build on new projects. The question of credibility. So when you have lots and lots of people that are working on one thing, how do you make sure that it all comes together and is documented in a coherent way that says that there was the backing of an entity with this goal in mind, and the product and the end result is credible and verifiable. I think there is still a very high bar of entry into the open source technology space. One of the things that Public Lab has done is to create a system called Newcomers Only, where we go into our open source code in GitHub and we break it down into very, very, very simple things that somebody who has never coded before will be able to do for themselves. And in this way, we've grown to about 500 people that are interacting in our open source software development system. So it's been really successful for us. We've also we do a lot of work with students in India and Nairobi, and actually in Argentina, who are coming to us through projects such as Google Summer of Code, Outreachy, and Rails Girls, which are several projects that try to link people who are new to coding with big open source communities like Public Lab. Open source is only as good as its documentation. I think this is really key, when you're talking about an open source toolkit for revisioning what prisons can be, when you're talking about your website, when you're talking about hardware. If you don't have good documentation, it's going to be problematic at some point down the line, because it's going to hinder the replicability and ability for people to do modifications. I think one of the things that we've run into as we've expanded and have had lots of people that are coming in from different countries to support the work that we're doing, especially in the online software space, being very cognizant of cultural language barriers, and also access to technology, and being able to work in structures so that we can be proactive about addressing those potential issues before they break literally a piece of our code. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there with the challenges. In terms of opportunities, and then we'll just open this up for conversation. There's so many opportunities inherent in open source. I think that projects that are open source, communities that are focused on being open, the ability to create public awareness and engagement, because you're saying there's so many points that we welcome you to be a part of this project, whether it's writing documentation, whether it's writing code, whether it's helping us to troubleshoot this project, whether it's actually using a tool, whether it's modifying it, for a project that you want to work on. The opportunities are endless. So it's a much better way to get people activated than if you're using, documentation and devices that don't allow people to be a part of the actual systems of those things. I think the outcomes of many of these projects have much higher levels of community relevance because you're able to modify on a local basis. We are able to fill in data gaps if we're open sourcing. So one of the great things about federal data sets is that many of them have been open sourced over the last decade. So rather than us having to kind of wade through proprietary licensing around these data sets, we can say, here's a great instead of aerial imagery from NOAA, but we have better aerial imagery specifically of this area in Louisiana. Let's pair it on top of each other, and then we have better data for everybody. I think there's also, it can help with broader understandings of the projects we're working on, and that goes beyond just data literacy or the technological literacy. It means that people have a much more intimate connection when they can kind of break apart, learn how things come together, and then build a project back. So in the sense of like an open source toolkit, being able to understand the entirety of the process rather than being handed a final result is going to build communities and people that have a higher degree of involvement and capacity for understanding the entirety of the project rather than just being just understanding what they're being told to do with an end result. So I'm going to stop there and I guess pass it back to Brittany and here for questions and whatever else you might want to talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. There's so much here, like it's a whole universe, and ambitious to be putting it on one call. So I'm curious if there's like a whole range of ways that we could take this conversation from the technicalities of creating an open source platform and looking at what open sourcing hardware or software, on digital platforms, like what that looks like and what the nuts and bolts of that look like. I also want to flag that there is a great huddle with David Wiley who talks particularly around Creative Commons and what just like open sourcing your IP and like kind of practical first steps with Creative Commons so if that's just a resource that I'm going to point people to in that corner of things. And I'd love to just like share one frame that I'm hearing you, especially as you're talking to the sort of advantages and opportunities of open source, not just as a tool, but as an organizing principle. And I'm actually just going to share this image really quick because it's something that one of our teams at Ashoka uses to help folks think through what scale looks like for them. So can people see my screen? Yeah. So just very quickly, like the basic notion here, and I know Norrin at least is on the phone and doesn't have video, but I'll send these images later and can send image descriptions as well. But the idea being like you could never create a movement with solely the direct impact created by you or your organization, and that the role of people activating this work, of fellows, of social entrepreneurs, of teams, of movements, is to create the pathways for people to be creating impact, whether or not you're getting up in the morning. And so Ashoka distinguishes that between direct impact, which is what are the things that your organization is directly doing. Norrin, you are flipping a prison in North Carolina. But what does the indirect impact look like? And if you look at the pathways for how to get to that indirect impact, we often think about this on an axis of how much control do you need and how quickly can you build a movement, or how wide can your movement grow is, I think, a more helpful frame than speed alone. But like, how big can you create how wide can you grow your movement, and how much control do you need? So kind of like the most control and the most narrow would be something like subsidiaries or franchises, moving all the way down the scale to open sourcing. And we talk a lot about, and I'll share these later, but I love that visual. And what I appreciate about it is the letting go of control that is inherent and necessary in what it looks like to move toward tools that are putting more people in charge, which is like, how do we let go of old paradigms of hierarchy? And how does that butt up with the legal infrastructure that has been built on that paradigm? So I'm just appreciating that piece of it, and hearing a lot of those threads and what you're sharing. And with that, let's just open the digital floor. Questions, reactions, from folks.
I'm curious about the, I had a note here. Oh, just what you said about the technicalities of an open source platform. I have no idea what that looks like, or what kind of software you would need, I guess, to build a website that is open source.
So we, I think there's packages that really simplify this process. Public Lab wanted to have we've kind of called it the Public Lab project. And we wanted to have a web resource that was so specific to what the community wanted. So it has gone through so many iterations over the last 10 years that we built it from scratch, and it's gone through a lot of iterations. One of the great things about it is that every piece of code for the site is it's held in GitHub. So somebody could take all of our code and they could use it and make their own website. So it's also our way to share back and say, we've put 10 years of time into really thinking through designing and creating this. And now here's the thing that you can take and remodel around the topic that, you're interested in. I do think that there are simpler software packages for being able to create things that are similar to publiclab.org, such as building in wiki pages. But I would say overall, if you're really like embedding open source into how you're doing your online resources, building a community that's going to be responsible for both the development and the maintenance of it is going to be really important.
I wonder if it might, could you, I think you have screen share capabilities, but I wonder if you could even open the platform and just point out a couple of ways of how people are actively contributing to the site and the knowledge base. Shannon. Does that make sense as a...
Yeah, let me, I'll just share my screen super quick.
And you should be able to pick what you're sharing. You should be able to
So this is publiclab.org. It's big for some reason. I'm not sure why, but so basically, let me get into it. Hopefully, no. I'm not logged in, that's why. Sorry, and Zoom is doing something weird, like taking over my entire top bar, so I can't click on anything.
Oh no.
There we go. So I'm just gonna go to, I'm gonna go to one of our pages. Let's see. Sorry, I have to be logged in to do this. This is gonna be a bit problematic, I think, because I don't remember my password. Okay, but for instance, so here is something that the user Joy of Soy shared recently, fighting the flood community activism and education in Pensacola. And they were able to share their work by posting, if you can see where I've clicked down on the bar, by posting a research note. So that's one of the many ways, and I'll just click on it so you can see the format. Sorry. But it basically, when you go into it, it gives you an entire system for being able to actually actively edit and write. We also have a system for asking questions. So like here, has anyone had any experience converting the Canon SD1000 to infrared? And this was posted by somebody, Shannon, not Shannon. And it's tagged to a lot of different wiki pages, and people are able to come in and if they're like, yeah, I've actually done this, they can respond to that question. We can also do things like subscribing, so we know if there's updates on the question. But you can see also, based on our very complex tagging system, that other things that may be in the similar realm or similar questions are popping up as well. So this is a way to build a community knowledge and data repository So for instance, if somebody a year ago had asked the similar question, that question actually may pop up on the sidebar, and we could point that person to it and say, oh, here's a thread where that's happening already. So it's in a way integrating almost like a forum model into a website as well. In the wiki, go back a step. Okay, so pages like this, Fighting the Flood, are individual notes. So people who are sharing a piece of their research or they're sharing a story from the work that they're doing. But then we also have a wiki, and these are pages that people are actively contributing to collectively. So this is something that we together can, sorry, I'm having an issue with this Zoom bar in the way of everything. I don't know what's going on, let me move that. So this is our community microscope project, and this is a project that we have been doing for like the last 7 months. So you can see there is information about workshops, different events that are coming up. We have all of the questions that are related to the community microscope linked here. We have different activities. You can actually ask a question on the page. It talks about, these are, when we're looking at the assembly piece, these are different research notes that are specifically about putting the microscope together. So if I clicked on a research note, for instance, this was written 5 days ago. This goes into a note system where one person, so two people, Bronwyn with Warren, wrote the note and did this kind of as their own body of work. But it links back to the broader wiki where people can then have conversations. And this is more kind of a technical documentation, you know, how to do on the project. Within the wiki pages, we also have things like a talk pad. So if I clicked on that, you'd be able to chat in real time with other people who may be wanting to discuss this issue. You can do both a direct edit of the wiki page, but also you can do kind of a practice edit. So you may not be 100% done with the edits you want to make, but you can kind of start framing out the new way that you would lay out this page. So this is very similar to how Wikipedia operates, but the wiki system that we've created has, I would call it advanced capabilities.
Awesome. Thank you, Shannon. That was, I learned a lot even just from just what the world of possibilities within, and how this would even apply, like thinking like Sharon, how this could apply to people creating green schoolyards in different ways and, but I am done asking questions because there are many people on this call.
Hey, Shannon, this is Norin from North Carolina, and thank you again for your work. This is impressive. I can't wait to look through your website. So good job. You mentioned the setting the values and norms. You mentioned principles. In some of our discussion, different open source communities use bylaws. Could you talk for a second about how you balance keeping the open source methodology in place while also ensuring fidelity to the model? I guess you touched on it some in your example with the monitors. If the air quality monitors are not up to a certain standard, then the data becomes fuzzy. For us, of course, we're dealing with a radically different frame in trying to create a open source public policy tool. And of course, for the greater service of decarceration in the U.S. So how have you guys balanced that?
So I think, there's two different strains. I think having a value system in place that all your contributors to the toolkit are abiding by is really important, because if you have that, you are saying that from the foundation, every time a new person comes into the project, they are agreeing that their ethical integrity is, going to be 100%. any, troubleshooting that they run into, it's not going to just be, kind of shuffled under a pile of papers and hidden. It's going to be something that's brought to the community, so that problems are transparent and solutions are equally as transparent. So I think having those kind of value systems for how you deal with open source products, and I'm going to refer to your toolkit as a product, is incredibly important. I think, like, more kind of logistically, we have bylaws for public lab, but we also try to segment as much as possible in the way that we talk about public lab as the nonprofit from the broader open source community, because there's things that we have to uphold and maintain as a skeleton and as an infrastructure so that the community can do the best work that they're doing. So if I sent out our bylaws to our community, that would not be a good value system or a set of guiding documents for how we operate in an open source space. But they are, legal documents for how we as the nonprofit then function to support that broader community. So I think that it's kind of like, for us, what's really worked is creating some set of division, but also just in our linguistics and the language around how we talk about our work and the people that are involved. We make some distinct kind of clarifications from the community versus the nonprofit structure. I also think, I said this a couple times, that the documentation piece is the most necessary thing to really maintaining a strong culture, because without documentation, it's nearly impossible with multiple people working on an open source product to go back and figure out where something might have broken. And it's anything from a broken piece of code to a broken workflow to a broken conversation. So making sure that all of the processes are documented in a way that a new person can come in and catch up on the entire life cycle and workflow of something is really going to benefit both the community and the broader kind of uptake of the project.
Thank you.
Shannon, thanks for all of that. This is Sarah again. I have a question about how, as the organization creating this platform and leading it all, how do you make sure that when you have these additions to the work, when people post something or explain something, that it's right? Is there somebody that's monitoring that within your organization? Like, I think about Wikipedia all the time. I wonder, is this definition that somebody's put up here, this explanation, right? Like, who is monitoring that and making sure that it is in fact correct?
Right. So great question. We have a moderators group. So it's a bunch of people who are pretty actively involved in public lab. I'd say there's probably 20 of them or so, and that kind of is reflective of the amount of conversations. But for instance, if somebody says something that may be interpreted as harmful to another person, conversation will happen with that moderators group, and then they'll figure out how to address that with the person that made the comment. And many times it can resolve in a way in which somebody says, "Wow, I didn't actually realize that what I was saying came off that way. I apologize, and I'll do better." I think one of the things that we've had to be conscious of, and this is online communities in general, it's not just open source online communities, are trolls. That's the kind of technical term for them, but people who are just in it for a fight. They know they have the ear of thousands and thousands of people and are going to kind of blab in ways that are completely inappropriate. So we also have systems that allow us to ban people and to completely shut down accounts and ability for people to access community resources until a problem has been resolved. We, in addition, because a lot of our work happens in person, we have a very similar moderator structure for our in-person time. So I think it's, translating kind of the work and lessons of facilitation into broader communities that can then help keep an eye on the conversations that are being had. But that's a great question, and I think it's a very, very necessary piece of like being able to uphold the culture that you've set once you have your principles, values, code of conduct in place.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Other questions, or even just like reflections or things that are sticking with you?
Hello.
Hello.
This is Adriana. How are you? I arrived a little bit later, sorry, but would like to share some of ideas of our work that we are doing in this same way, and that maybe is helpful to be together and to organize a space. We are working about a system change in fashion, yes. And we have this ECOSOC status consultative at United Nations, where we organize events in each of the commissions and sessions. And what we are doing is a very interesting work in a collaborative way with many academics and professionals around this theme, and in many universities that are thinking how to help and construct in models and through economics model and understanding the behavior of people, how to help a change in this industry, no? And natural fibers are one of our main themes that are really important because involve so many areas and aspects of the problems we have nowadays around the world, as the rural population that is leaving their spaces, young people, women that are under poverty, and also these conducts that they cannot breed their animals that many times are very important for the ecosystem and for the production they have, yes. So we are doing a very interesting work in this area, trying to help local development and to create more transparent tools for local markets and to make bridges with the fashion industry. For example, with camelids, no? That are a very interesting fiber, as good and better than cashmere, but it's not very well known in the industry. So we would love to have a space together and to create a group around these themes.
That's great. That's really interesting. And I think I've been really impressed as I've done work within the open science hardware space. There's a lot of people that are from Mendoza and Buenos Aires that participate in it and really feel like kind of the open source ethos and ability to create culture and community through those models is very, very important to them. So it's cool to hear what you're doing as well.
Okay. And who you are working in Mendoza?
There's a couple of people. I'm happy to, how about I follow up on an email with you afterwards?
Okay.
Cool.
Okay, great, thank you.
And I actually just chatted to you, Adriana, there's a huddle coming up next week that's all around like how do you change norms within an industry? Like how do you people whose model is around creating a policy change within a particular industry or a larger institution outside of public policy, but that would like change the way that something is done. So check that out. Friends, we are coming up on the end of our time.
Was very difficult to hear you. Sorry, we couldn't hear.
I can write you. I'll write you, Adriana.
I'll chime in. Hi, my name is Sharon, and I'm from California. I work with a nonprofit called Green Schoolyards America, and I've been really enjoying your description of the work that you do. It sounds fantastic, and the work we're essentially trying to help schools convert paved asphalt schoolyards into parks, and so that's like the general frame. Do that in California and nationally with Green Schoolyards America, and internationally with an organization called the International School Grounds Alliance. And so I'd say most of our work is probably collective impact rather than open sourced, but we've thought about like, are there pieces of it that could be open sourced? I guess that would be most easily applied to like data collection, maybe about looking at individual, like really small issues like surface temperatures of different materials when things are paved versus not, or having children collect data and other. We probably will, but again, I think it's more collective impact than open source. I'm wondering if you think of, I see for our industry, privacy issues in various ways. I mean, when schools are, anything with children is challenging to share information, even the photographs, or especially the photographs online of people doing the work or of sharing their practice is often involves children and privacy. And for me too, even with the collective impact model, for us, the biggest barrier probably is being able to fund the time it takes to coordinate people or to put up a platform. And so I came a little late, it's early here in California, but I was wondering I don't know if you already talked about funding models that help you to support an ecosystem of things happening in the movement that you're trying to build.
Yeah, and just to touch on the privacy piece, we definitely we kind of segregate the data privacy question from the open source modeling at many different points. So, for instance, we supported a woman who was doing mapping work in a Palestinian community that's directly next to Jerusalem with children. And it was really important that the data that came out of that project was private, she was still using open source methods and sending questions back to the broader community, but the data piece of it was not held in the public domain. So that was a very different instance. And another case in Wyoming where there's things called slap suits that companies can put on people if they do environmental monitoring or like do too much question asking around fracking industry. The ask from the community was to keep the data private until all of the project was done, rather than releasing it at points so that it wouldn't be so obvious to the company what they were doing and their activism. So there's a lot of different models for keeping data private during projects until communities are okay with letting them be open or in the public space. And I think for us, we always follow what the community wants. There's zero question about that. For funding models, so a lot of what we've done is we have this kind of core nonprofit piece to us. Our funding, if you look at our budget per year, there's significant amounts of it that go to supporting other projects. And I think that's basically like how we have kind of supported the crux of different groups that are going to be working with us. We also sell the open source kits that we make. You can sell open source kits. It's great. There are business models. We sell them and we make a profit, and that's unrestricted funding that we can then cycle back to projects that we may not be able to get funded through grants. So, I mean, there's even like in the kind of toolkit, that you're talking about or that Norn was talking about, making that something that, potentially could be a part of your financial business model, that, somebody pays $20, here's all of the great work that you've done, and here's the different places that you kind of modify based on where your school is, or the type of asphalting you have in your school. But it's still, potentially something that you could use to then support financially other groups.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great question. And like, I don't know, indicative of like the legal horizons that you seem to be looking at, Shannon, as far as, or at least, yeah.
Brittany, we can't hear you. A lot of the time when you're talking today, that your microphone is completely like scrambled and muted. I'm not sure what's up.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, pop back in now.
No. So you can't hear, this is not working.
It's just very soft.
Okay. Well, we're at time. And so what I will do is follow up with the recording of this and other resources that have been flagged. And any last, okay, yeah, I'm gonna chat.
How about I say, okay, so Brittany says she's going to follow up with resources from this, and thank you all for being here. Are there any final comments or questions before we depart?
Hey, this is Norin. If folks are available to field some questions over emails or whatever format you need afterwards, that would be great. I think this has brought up a lot for us to think about, and it will probably generate some further questions. And thanks for the time.
Yeah, thank you. I just left my my email address if anybody would like to reach out to me. Brittany, is there a Slack group for Ashoka Fellows? All right. So please, if anybody has questions for myself, my email is there, and then perhaps we can share emails for broader conversation as well. I think that's on Brittany, though.
I'll do it.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's really helpful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Really interesting.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks
Bye.
again. Bye-bye.
Yeah.